Thank you for the presence of each one of us and for allowing us to be gathered today with our speakers to realize once again the value of life amid the fast-changing world. We ask you to bless us, our family and loved ones, and especially those who are suffering at this moment. Grant us the grace to integrate our learning today, that we may live in right relationship with you, with ourselves, with one another, and with creation. Through Christ our Lord. Amen. Then of the Father, and of the Son, of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Bayang mabiliw, perlas ng silanganan, alam ng puso, sa dibdib mo'y buhay. Lupang hinirang, duyan ka ng magiging, sa manlulupig, di ka pasisingin, sa dagat at bundok, sa simoy at sa langit mong bakaw, may nilagang tulad, awit sa paglayang minamahal, ang kisag ng watawat mo'y tagumpay na nagtitinig, ang bituin at araw niya kailan pa may di magdidinig, lupa ng araw ng walhati pagsinta, buhay ay langit sa piling mo. Aming ligaya na pag may mga api, mamamatay ng dahil sa'yo.
All right. Now, good morning once again. To formally begin our symposium and to formally welcome us in this event, ladies and gentlemen, let us give him a virtual round of applause, the Dean of Studies of St. Paul Seminary, Father Norman Melchor Peña Jr., SSP.
So good morning, everyone. I think it's best if we remove the slides first, JN. Yeah, so at least that people can see faces. So I welcome you all. Good morning. I'm Father Norman. I'm actually the Dean of Studies of St. Paul Seminary Foundation here in Silang. And I am happy to welcome all of you in our Educational Institute for the International Philosophy Symposium on Nonviolence, Ahimsa in the Light of Jainism. A special welcome, of course, to Dr. Shinetra Pandey and Dr. Kujin Bohanek, our speakers, who will be sharing a particular way of peace from experience and thoughts lived in the narratives of nonviolence. Here we can very well cite Nietzsche, who said, "He who has a why to live can bear with almost anyhow." And I guess that it is, peace is always something that is supposed to be lived. And I guess here it's where Jainism is always a champion, we could say as well. Living that life of peace and non-violence as a way of respecting as well our world today. Indeed, we are happy to have each one of you in this symposium. And in this, we welcome and we thank the Modern Asian Thoughts class for preparing this, especially Professor James Piscos, and for all the events that happens here as well. So in behalf of St. Paul again, we welcome you, and I am happy to recommend as well this symposium to each and every one of you. May each and every one of us find enlightenment as a way of peace. Thank you.
Thanks, Father Norman. Currently, I am looking at the number of participants, and currently we have 157 participants and counting. So I welcome every one of us to this event. Majority of those who registered in the provided registration link came from, of course, the St. Paul Seminary, There are also from the San Beda University and the Centro Escolar University. And of course, I also acknowledge the presence of our respected international guests, resource speakers. Okay, so your presence is highly appreciated. Okay, so without further ado, let us already proceed with the presentation proper of our guests. So to help us understand about or to be enlightened about the concept of nonviolence or the so-called Ahimsa in the Jain tenet of their philosophy, I am glad to announce that we will be having two esteemed experts in such field. So now I give the floor to Miss Minette Marie Villamayor, third year philosophy major, for the introduction of our first resource speaker.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kalubag JM. So this man has taken a PhD in philosophy from the Banaras Hindu University in Varanasi. He currently serves as Joint Director of International School of Jain Studies or ISJS in Pune. He was awarded with 2 junior research fellowships from the Philosophical Council of Ministry of Education and Ministry of Culture from the Government of India. He has been the editor of various research journals on humanities, and presently, he is the editor of an online research journal, ISJS Transactions. So let us please welcome Dr. Shrinetra Pandey.
Namaskar, Jai Jinendra. Good morning from International School for Jain Studies, India. First of all, I would like to thank organizers, particularly Professor James and his associates for this opportunity to discuss the Jain view of Ahimsa, that is non-violence. As you know, 2 lectures are scheduled to be delivered here on the topic today. For the first lecture, I am here to discuss the philosophy of Ahimsa, the concept of Ahimsa. And in the second lecture, my friend Dr. Kozen Bonet from Arihant Academy will discuss the applications of Ahimsa. So I had prepared a PowerPoint presentation for my talk. So I'll share my screen. Is it visible?
Yes, we can see it clearly, Doc.
Thank you. So I welcome you all to my talk on Ahimsa, foundation of Jain way of life. It is well-known fact that in today's society, conflict among people, conflict among faiths is prevalent everywhere, in every society, in every region, in every country. So this conflict creates violence. Generally, conflicts arises when we disagree with others or when someone hurts our ego or self-respect. Sometimes reactions come out through violent actions and a person commit major crime. So if we talk about the different religions or different faiths, the religions in the world have a motto to unite the people of world in brotherhood and love. But due to malintentions of the leaders and stanchness of the followers, some conflict prevail among the religions. It is well known from the history that countless wars have been fought in the name of the religions. Many staunch followers do not understand the real essence of religion, and they consider themselves better than other religious followers. Hence, they hate others and as a result, a communal violence occurs. So, as we know, every nation has its own legal constitution, which is at some level helpful in stoppage or minimization of violence. Uh, Rights and duties are the basis of the constitution of any country. If we follow our constitution, so chance of committing violence will be minimum. We all know that the framing of legal constitution is a later phenomena. So the question arises here, what were the guiding principles for the society before that period? So was there any constitution? So my answer is yes. The code of conduct depicted in our religious texts, in our philosophical text, guided us to live a peaceful life and to create a peaceful and harmonious environment in society. And the society at that time felt a sort of obligation to abide by those rules as well as customs. The relevance of those code and conducts is still very significant. In liberally speaking, those may be designated as a religious constitution. In Indian tradition, these constitutions are called way of life, different ways of life. In Jainism, which is one of the most prominent religious tradition of India, this code of conduct is called vow, vrata. Before I come to the Ahimsa of Jainism, non-violence depicted in Jainism, I would like to present a brief introduction of Jain tradition. According to the Jain tradition, in every cycle, that is called RI Jain technical terms, in every cycle of cosmology, 24 Tirthankars appear. They present the present time cycle begins with its first Tirthankar, Lord Rishabdev, who is considered a pre-Vedic. His time goes around 5,005 years ago from today. So according to Jain tradition, he was the founder of civilization. And Mahavir is the 24th and last Tirthankar of this cycle. If we talk about the basic principles in Jain tradition, theories of Ahimsa, non-violence, theory of Anekant, that is manifoldness, and Aparigraha, non-possession. These are three basic principles of Jainism. So in Jain tradition, non-violence is the supreme spiritual virtue. It directs us to avoid injury to ourselves as well as other living being by our action of mind, body, and speech. So we will discuss it later in detail. The second is Anekantavad, manifoldness. So manifoldness is a unique gift of Jain tradition to the world. According to Jainism, truth is multifaceted. And seekers of truth view reality from different viewpoints depending upon their intentions and knowledge level. So each viewpoint is relative and represents partial truth. So we cannot say that views of one philosopher is right and while other are wrong. So they may be true from their angle. Hence, the harmony towards the person of different ideas should be maintained. So all the religious and philosophical thoughts have some truth or true value, but we have to examine and then accept them as the ultimate. We know a part of truth according to our objective and capabilities. The three pillars of Anekantavad, namely tolerance, existence of opposites, and reconciliation, show the way for conflict resolution. Anekantavad suggests us that the thoughts of different individuals may have some component of truth. Hence, we should try to understand and respect other points of view. It will help us to help us avoiding many possible conflicts and resolving them in a harmonious atmosphere. Aparigraha is the third important theory of Jain philosophy. Aparigraha means non-possession or limiting possessions, or you can say limiting desires. So in Jainism, it is mentioned that possession of whatever sort, great or small, living or non-living, lead to economic inequality. So Jainism holds that if we want to establish peace in society, then economic inequality and vast differences in the mode of consumption should be at least minimized. Among the cause of wars and conflicts which disturbs our social peace, the will for possession is the prime because it causes economic disbalance. So due to economic disbalance or inequality, classes of poor and rich came into existence and resulted in class conflicts. So according to Jain philosophy, it is only through the self-imposed limitation of possession and simple living we can restore peace and harmony in the society. Now, we see some special consideration in Jain tradition. So according to Jain philosophy, the cosmos is real and consists of living and non-living. In Jain technical term, Jiva and Ajiva. So, and this cosmos is uncreated and eternal. It has neither beginning nor an end, though it undergoes through modifications in every moment as per the natural laws of interactions between these two categories of existence. So Jainism deliberately rejects the conception of a supreme personality responsible for the creation of this world, the creation of this universe. No divine interference is accepted in Jainism. Jain worship of Tirthankar, Jain worship of God is not for the grace or favors, but to enhance the virtue of individuals. Every living being is responsible for his or her acts and the results thereof. So, Jain tradition implies their firm belief in self-effort, that is called shram, to achieve their own objectives, maybe it worldly or transworldly. They do not believe in the role of any supernatural power or divine grace in the achievement of our objectives. Jainism looks upon man himself as a god when his inherent powers are fully in blossom. God in Jain theory is being only another word for the soul at its best. So Jainism, more than any other creed, gives absolute religious independence and freedom to a man. So nothing can intervene between the actions which we do and the fruits thereof. So with this brief introduction to Jain tradition, I move forward to the way of life. So in India, more than 64 philosophical traditions were found, and they all claim themselves as a way of life. But in current scenario, very few traditions exist. If you try to understand their philosophical ground or philosophical ways, primarily we find two types of ways of life. Way of life based on ahimsa or non-violence, and on the other hand, way of life based on truth. In Indian technical term, satya. So when I say that this philosophy or this religion or this way of life is based on ahimsa or this is based on truth, it does not mean that there is only one value in their particular religion or in their particular philosophy. There may be a number of other values, but all other values are there to strengthen the value of ahimsa, or the values are there to strengthen the value of truth. In Jain tradition, Ahimsa is considered as supreme value, and all other values depicted in Jain philosophy are there for strengthen the Ahimsa, the value of Ahimsa. Now we see what is the meaning of Ahimsa in general, and what is the meaning and definition of Ahimsa, particularly in Jain tradition. So in general, Ahimsa means non-violence, non-injury, non-killing, or not hurting anyone. But how Jain tradition define it? In Jain tradition, actually Jain tradition goes many steps ahead while defining Ahimsa. According to Jain philosophers, according to Jain thinkers, Ahimsa means refraining from the injury of living beings by the activities of the mind, body, and speech, by way of doing it, by getting it done by someone else, and by the approval when it is done by someone else. So as you can see in the slide, I have given a different color to three groups of words. So we say them one by one. First group of word is living being. So if we describe scientifically a living thing pertains to any organism or a life form that possesses or shows the characteristics of life or being alive. Having an organized structure, requiring energy, responding and adapting to environmental changes, and being capable of reproduction, growth, movement, metabolism, and death. So these are the fundamental characteristics of living things. Jain tradition agrees with the definition, and according to Jainism, a substance having sense organs is called a living being. So there are 5 types of sense organs: skin, tongue, nose, eyes, and ear. And the object of the 5 senses are respectively touch, taste, smell, color, and sound. So on the basis of presence of different sense organs, so there are 5 categories of living beings. One sense living beings like plants, water, earth, fire, and air. So one sense living being possesses only one sense, that is touch. Two sense living beings like worms, lices, snails, etc. So two sense living being possess 2 senses, touch and taste only. 3 sense living being possess 3 senses, touch, taste, and smell. Yes, touch, taste, and smell. So some mini beasts such as ants, fleas, plant lice, cotton seeds insects, termites, and centipedes are 3 living beings, 3 sense living beings. 4 sense living beings possess 4 senses: touch, taste, smell, and sight. Some mini beasts such as wasps, flies, mosquitoes, butterflies, scorpions, etc. are 4 sense living beings. Then 5 sensed. So 5 sensed living beings possess 5 senses: touch, taste, smell, sight, and hearing. So larger animals such as fish, birds, human, etc. are 5 sensed living beings. So Jain tradition suggests avoiding or minimizing the injury of one sense to 5 sense living beings. Second group of words is activity of mind, body, and speech. So violence may occur through our mind, through our speech, or through our actions. So these 3 are the channels of committing violence. So first of all, violence generates in our mind, and then it comes to our speech and action, giving rise to conflict. So controlling the activity of mind is most important. any act performed under the thoughts with anger, arrogance, deceit, or greed results in violence. Third group of words is the definition of committing violence: by doing it, by getting it done, and by approval. So this is the uniqueness of Jainism while defining Ahimsa. Violence may occur through our mind, speech, and action, but not only this. To motivate or to support others for violence is also considered as violence. So, in this way, in Jain tradition, Ahimsa has a much broader connotation. Mahavir suggested that no living being should be killed or governed, made slave, tortured, and made restless. So all these are considered as violence. All these are considered as himsa. Hence, violence is not just killing a living being, but any form of torture, exploitation, mental or physical harm is also violence. So it provides directive ways to think, speak, and behave in such a manner that does not hurt anyone. Harming the plants, polluting water and air are also act of violence according to Ahimsa. So Ahimsa can act as an important instrument in conflict resolution and in the establishment of religious and social harmony. Now, question is, why Ahimsa? Ahimsa is the central concept of Jain ethics. So the question arises in our mind, why Ahimsa? Why do we practice Ahimsa? Jainism has a beautiful philosophy behind this concept. According to Jain tradition, we must each remember that I am a soul, not a body. I am eternal, constant, and pure. All around me in this universe, every single living being, big and small, human and non-human, plant and organism, has a soul just like me. All souls are eternal. Each soul is independent and individual. All souls are spiritually equal to one another. So, psychology behind the concept of Ahimsa is all souls want to live in peace and happiness. Each soul has the same feeling for happiness and suffering. No soul wants or desires suffering. All souls have the same right to live peacefully and undisturbed as I do. Since all souls are just like me and have the same rights and privileges as I do, I have no right to harm, kill, torture, disturb, or interfere in any way in the life and existence of another soul. How to practice Ahimsa? How to practice non-violence? So there are two ways in Jainism to practice Ahimsa. Restriction of activities of mind, body, and speech, and vigilance or carefulness in performing our activities. Then question is, how to restrict our activities? So Jain tradition says abstaining from what is wrong. For example, while receiving or placing anything whatsoever, while sitting, walking, in all such activities, so to restrict bodily operations that causing harm to any form of life can be avoided. During the verbal exchanges, to avoid injuring small life forms. If you interact with any Jain ascetics, you will find that they keep their mouth covered with a piece of cloth. Then controlling of mind means refrain from sinful intentions. So similarly, if we discuss about the carefulness, we can say that walking cautiously while walking, looking carefully on all sides in the area one is traveling through so as to cause trouble to no living being. To speak what is true, beneficial and free from doubt. Uh, Acquiring means correctly for the livelihood without harming any form of living being. Handling articles in correct manner, properly inspecting and testing them before moving them so that no living being is injured. To dispose of things that are no use at a place free from defects. So in this way, we saw here that there are two ways to practice ahimsa: refraining from what is wrong and undertaking what is right. So in this way, ahimsa is the fundamental value of Jain way of life. But as we saw in the definition, it is very difficult to practice completely, particularly for a layman, for a householder. So keeping this difficulty of practice in mind, the entire Jain way of life is divided into two categories: Mahavrata and Aduvrata. Mahavrata means practicing the way of life completely, and Aduvrata means practicing the way of life partially. Mahavrata is called major vows, and Aduvrata is called minor vows. For practicing completely, complete renunciation is required. That is not possible for a layman. That is not possible for a householder. So that's why laymen are suggested to follow the way partially. We will see how the same vows which are prescribed for ascetics are suggested to follow by householders partially. 5 minor vows are prescribed for a layman to practice, and the first is ahimsa. As we already discussed that literal meaning of ahimsa is to refrain from himsa, to refrain from violence. But it is not possible for a layman. So for layman, what is the meaning of ahimsa? For layman, ahimsa means minimizing violence. So how to minimize? So I will discuss it later. The second is satya, truth. Truth means, so literal meaning is not telling a lie. So Jain acharyas, Jain philosophers, Acharya Amrit Chand is a very prominent Jain philosopher, says that a statement made out of passion such as anger, greed, conceit, deceit, etc., that is not commendable should certainly be known as untruth. So definition of truthfulness according to Jain Acharya Umaswati. Umaswati is a very prominent thinker, prominent philosopher, and his work Tatvar Sutra is very famous among both the traditions, Shwetambar and Digambar. He says, neither telling nor promoting others to tell untruth, and also not telling or promoting others to tell a truth that may injure others. So this is the vow of truth according to Jain tradition. So as we can see here, that the truth that may injure others is not permitted to speak. So in this regard, Jain Acharya Amrit Chand says, neither speaking nor promoting others to speech which is disagreeable, sinful, and unpleasant to others. So what is disagreeable speech? Disagreeable speech means scornful, harsh, nonsensical, and useless gossip. Second is sinful speech. Sinful speech means prompting others to engage in piercing, splitting, beating, plowing, trading, or stealing, etc. So such activities lead to the destruction of life. Uh, unpleasant, unpleasant speech. The statements which may cause in others discomfort, fear, regret, enmity, grief, hostility. So this is called, that type of speeches are called unpleasant speech. Now the third aduvrat, third minor vow is asteya, non-stealing. So unless given, neither taking for himself nor giving to anyone else, anything that has been kept, dropped, or forgotten is called the vow of non-stealing. On the contrary, taking anything which has not been given is stealing. Fourth is celibacy or brahmacharya. So literal meaning of brahmacharya is to be free from sexual inclination. But it is possible only for ascetics. For householders, for a layman, complete avoidance is impossible. So that's why for householder, this vow is called Swadar Santosh, not Brahmacharya. Swadar Santosh. So the word Swadar Santosh is the combination of three words. Swa means own. Dar means wife or spouse. And Santosh means satisfaction. Meaning to be satisfied with own wife or own spouse is the vow of Swadar Santosh. So in this way, if we try to define the vow of celibacy for householder, for a layman, we can say that neither visiting nor causing any other to visit another's spouse is called the vow of celibacy for layman, for householder. The fifth is aparigraha, non-possession. So aparigraha means to renounce the worldly possessions. But again, aparigraha is not possible for a layman. It is possible only for an ascetic. So first, for householder, what a householder can do? A householder can limit his possessions or desires. So that's why for householder, this vow is called parimit parigraha or ichha parimar. Parimit parigraha means limiting possessions. Ichha parimar means limiting desires. So in this way, we can say that giving up desires for obtaining unnecessary worldly possessions is called the vow of non-possession for a layman, non-possession for a householder. So Jain scriptures emphasizes two type of possession: external and internal. External possession means the possession of living being and lifeless objects such as living beings such as husband, wife, children, servant, and lifeless like cloth, house, money, jewelry, etc. And internal possession is the possession of wrong belief, possession for sex, possession for four type of passions. These are considered as internal possessions. So in Jainism, it is made very clear that possession of such wide-ranging implications needs to be controlled. Without such control, social and individual progress is impossible. So in this way, we saw here in brief about all five minor vows. Among these five, the first, Ahimsa, is main or supreme. And the role of other four vows are to strengthen the vow of Ahimsa, the vow of non-violence. As we have already discussed, Ahimsa for a layman means minimizing violence. So in Jain text, 4 types of violence have been discussed: occupational violence, domestic violence, defensive or protective violence, and the 4th is intentional violence. Occupational violence is that which performed in the exercise of one's profession or occupation, whether of a soldier, agriculturist, trader, or industrialist. And domestic violence is that which is unavoidably committed in the performance of necessary domestic duties, such as preparation of food, keeping things clear, grinding floor, building a house, walking, bathing, and similar other performance of daily life or daily routine. Third is defensive or protective violence. What is protective violence? Protective violence is that which is committed in the defense of self and property against invaders and enemies. 4th is intentional violence. So, intentional violence is that which is committed intentionally or knowingly. For example, killing men, animals, or other lower creatures for food, amusements, decorations, etc. So for this purposes, if we kill a living being knowingly, intensely, so this type of violence is called intentional violence. So for a layman, it is essential to abstain from intentional violence, not from the industrial or domestic or defensive violence. As it is not possible for him to do so while living at the householder's stage. However, a layman is advised to try his best to avoid as much as possible the first 3 kinds of violence as well. And a householder has to make a steady progress in this direction also. Because the ultimate goal of human life, according to Indian tradition, particularly Jain tradition, to achieve moksha, liberation from this worldly life. And to achieve this goal, complete renunciation is must. And according to Jainism, this complete renunciation is possible only through the ascetic life. So this is the goal of human life, to achieve moksha through the ascetic life. So purpose of this a layman's life is to prepare himself to you can say enter into ascetic life. So a householder vow of Ahimsa means to refrain from intentional violence. But to refrain from intentional violence is also not an easy task. To prepare man to put into practice some other practices are prescribed in Jainism as prerequisites. So 3 types of practices have been discussed as prerequisites for primary practices of Ahimsa. Food practices based on non-violence, moral abstaining from 7 types of vices, and practice of forgiveness as essential practice. Now we see them one by one. So first I come to the food practices. This is considered as fundamental virtue in Jainism. The first virtue is to give up the consumption of wine. Second is to give up the consumption of flesh, to give up the consumption of meat. Third virtue is to give up the consumption of honey. The reason behind not to consume honey is that if we consume honey, which drops down from the honeycomb on its own, or that obtained through some trick, in both cases we do grave violence, because without killing or hurting honeybees, it is impossible to take even a single drop of honey. So that's why the Jain tradition has suggested to give up the consumption of honey. To give up 5 udambar fruits. Udambar means milky fruits. Gular, anjeer, banyan, peepal, and pakar. So, for example, Jain texts have given these 5 names, these 5 kinds of trees. So, udambar means milky fruits belonging to the fig class. So, you can say a man, a householder even, should give up the fruits belonging to the fig class. Why? The udambar fruits are the birthplace of many types of microbes. So, therefore, eating of these fruits causes violence of those living beings. So, in this way, a householder or a layman should not consume wine, flesh, honey, and fruits belonging to fig classes. Now, I come to the 7 vices which are advised to give up for the practice of Ahimsa. The first is gambling. A layman should not play gamble. Second is meat eating. A layman should not consume meat. Third is taking wine. A layman should not consume wine. So these 2, not to take wine and flesh, we discussed them in food practice as 8 fundamental virtues. Fourth is sexual relation with prostitute. So having sexual relation with a prostitute is also not permitted in Jainism. Fifth is hunting. A layman should not hunt animals. Stealing. A householder should not take anything without the permission of its owner. We discussed it in 5 minor vows also. Seventh is having sexual relation with others' spouse. So this is also not permitted in Jainism. So these are the 7 moral abstinences suggested for a layman to practice before observing the 5 minor vows, particularly before observing Ahimsa. So these moral abstinences from 7 vices and these fundamental virtues which we discussed in previous slide, to follow these observances is necessary if a layman or if a man want to practice ahimsa in the real sense. Beside these moral abstinences, non-violent food practice, so beside these, practice of forgiveness is very important. And this practice you will find everywhere, in every religion of the world. The practice of forgiveness is very important. In Jainism, 6 essential practices are prescribed for each and every person. And these practices are called essentials. In Jain technical term, these practices are called avasyak. So if a man or woman does not practice them, then he or she is not a Jain by practice according to Jainism. For being a Jain, it is necessary to practice 6 essentials, and forgiveness is one of them. So forgiveness is very important. So we find 2 ways there to practice forgiveness. So first is pratikraman and the second is pratyakhyan. Pratikraman means to recollect the mistakes and seek forgiveness for them. So a layman should try to recollect the mistakes which he or she has committed in his or her life and should seek forgiveness for them. And pratyakhan means to take a vow not to make mistakes, and practice right path in future. So in this way, these three types of practices, non-violence based food practice, moral abstinence of saving vices, and practice of forgiveness make a person able to practice ahimsa based way of life as depicted in Jain tradition. So a most important thing which I would like to mention here, that when we talk about ahimsa, we generally think that we think of not killing or not hurting others through words or action. But this is perhaps only 10% of the fullness of ahimsa. Jain text Prashna Vyakaran Sutra. In the second chapter of Prashna Vyakaran Sutra, we find 64 synonyms of ahimsa, and among them more than 55 terms indicate the affirmative sense of ahimsa, such as kindness, compassion, love, fearlessness, equanimity, forgiveness, service, pity, friendship, tolerance, and so on. So in this way, we discussed the philosophy and practice of ahimsa, that is the foundation of Jain way of life. We will get a flavor of social application in next session by Dr. Kozen Bohnek. So once again, I thank you all and organizers for giving me this opportunity to share my ideas on ahimsa in Jainism. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for patience listening. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you also, Dr. Shrinetra Pandey. That was indeed a very insightful presentation. Personally, what struck me the most is in the first parts of the slide, wherein you mentioned with regard to the perspective of treating every being that they all have a soul, and so with that perspective, it follows the our notion of respecting them, not avoiding intentional violence towards them because they too have a soul. Okay, so the audience also, I know, they also have questions in mind, but I suggest you reserve it first because we'll first proceed with our second speaker before the question and answer portion. So once again, I give the floor to Miss Minette Villamayor for the introduction of the second speaker.
All right. So our next presenter has a PhD in Historical and Cultural Studies of Religion from the Center of Dharma Studies, or CDS, at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California, with areas of specialization in Hindu, Jain, and Buddhist studies. He is a co-editor and contributing author of the 3-volume series on contemplative studies and Dharma traditions. So Dr. Bohanek is currently the assistant professor in Jain studies in Arinhata Academy. So let us all welcome Dr. Kogen Bohanek.
Okay, thank you all very much, and thank you for the wonderful introduction. Thank you to the organizers for providing me with this opportunity to speak, particularly Dr. James Piscos. It was very kind of you to reach out to us. And I also really enjoyed the lecture by my friend and colleague, Shrinetra Pandey. That was a really lovely way to sort of create space for me to elaborate a little bit, or maybe give a little application, as he so kindly put it. So thank you, everybody, for having me here. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm going to go over to screen share now, and we can look at my slides. Okay, so as Dr. Pandey pointed out, nonviolence is very much central to the Jain tradition. And I think that scholars of religion for millennia, for centuries, have recognized that there's something very special about the Jain tradition and the Jain emphasis on nonviolence, the way it really is the hub of the religion. All nonviolence is present in all religions, as Dr. Pandey pointed out. It's there in all religions. So Jainism isn't unique in the emphasis on nonviolence, but there is something unique about the emphasis and the centrality of nonviolence. And so let's see if we can look at that a little bit more. So the Jain tradition is one of what we might call the Dharma traditions. And I'll start off a little bit comparative here, just so you can get an orientation about what makes Jain theology and Jain philosophy special. The Dharma traditions include Hinduism, Buddhism, and the Jain tradition, Jainism or Jain Dharma, otherwise known as. And these traditions all have some interesting elements in common. And I'll start off with the agreements that these traditions have before I go into some of the details about what makes each of these different traditions unique. And if you could kindly mute your mics, I would appreciate that very much. Thank you. So all of the Dharma traditions, Buddhism, Hinduism, and Jainism, all have this belief in karma. Now, the word karma is considered to have been naturalized in the English language. That means that if you look at an English dictionary, you'll find the word karma. And actually, we probably have heard the word karma used in daily conversations. I hear it on TV all the time. However, there is a slight difference between the way the Dharma traditions understand the term karma and the way karma is used in the common sense in the English language. So in the English language, there is something that English speakers have that's right about karma. Karma is kind of sort of golden rule. If you do good to others, you can expect the same to yourself, that each action that you take, every choice you make, every decision you make will have a consequence in like. So if you have malicious choices and malicious actions, then you can expect those to be reciprocated to you. If you have compassionate choices, compassionate actions, then you can expect that to also be reciprocated. So in that sense, the English language does sort of understand karma theory. However, there's a big difference where there's a misunderstanding with karma theory amongst English speakers commonly. And often, unfortunately, in the English language, people use the word karma derisively, like to put somebody down, like to say that somebody deserves what they get, and to have a sort of sense of derision. So when you see somebody you don't like, something bad happens to them, you kind of laugh and you say, oh, that's their karma. And that's really not the proper use of the term karma, because the way karma works is it's inherently connected to the idea of reincarnation, that all of us have been reincarnating anadi since beginningless time. And every single action that we've done has created this sort of karmic repository of all of this karma that's going to come into fruition. And in the countless past lives that we have lived, we've committed countless acts of violence for which we will ultimately be held accountable. So every time we may have hurt somebody in the past, intentionally or non-intentionally, if we have benefited from violence anywhere, which arguably we all do benefit from systems of violence, then we have a karmic debt, so to speak. And so based on that, all of us can expect one thing, and that is that we will be suffering in the future based on the countless actions that we've done in our past lives. And if you understand the relationship between karma and reincarnation, when you see somebody suffering, even if you don't like them or if you think they deserve it, you won't look at them with derision. Rather, you will look at them with compassion. So when the English speaker uses karma to mean derision, like, oh, they deserve what they get, and indifference, that's an inappropriate use of the word karma. The word karma should much rather have a connotation of compassion, because if you understand the link between karma and reincarnation, then you yourself know that you will one day be suffering, and you would hope that other people will react compassionate to you. So that's an important link between karma and reincarnation. And this is a common belief that all three of the Dharma traditions share. Now, this is also linked to the idea of samsara. Samsara is the cycle of birth, life, death, and then life is characterized by old age, disease, loss, all of these things happen to us during the course of life, and then we die and we're reborn, and it's a very painful existence over and over again. Even though there may be some pleasant things that happen in life, the overall balance of life is lost, because after all, everybody you know is going to die. You're going to lose everything that you have, and then you yourself will suffer from disease, old age, and death ultimately. So this idea of the constant rebirth, where this sort of reincarnation, cycle of reincarnation is primarily characterized by suffering, that term is samsara. And that is another thing that is a common belief to all the Dharma traditions. Now, let's talk about this idea of samsara a little bit more, so I can start to try to give you a sense of how this applies to your day-to-day life. For whatever reason, and I think we can all agree on this, irrespective of our philosophy, irrespective of our religious traditions, I think we can all agree that we're born into this world for some reason with a sense of incompleteness. We just are not complete. We don't have everything that we need. And in order to try to feel more complete, we direct our attention externally. We think, if I can just get this thing, I will feel more complete. If I can just get this thing, I will be more complete. So, for example, I spent a lot of time in school because I felt that I was incomplete and inadequate in terms of my level of knowledge and intelligence. So I went to school to gain knowledge so that I would feel more complete and more intelligent. And that's really the source of desire. Desire is that strange sense of incompleteness that we have that causes us to look externally to try to get something so that we will feel more complete. However, the idea that gaining something external to us will make us happy is misplaced. It's actually a misunderstanding. We can't ultimately get happiness from external things. So whether I get a better job, a greater income, whether I find the spouse of my dreams, which I'm fortunately enough to have the spouse of my dreams, whether I have a promotion in my job, whether I graduate college, all of those things will feel pleasant, but they're not ultimately the source of happiness. So when we feel incomplete and we direct our desire externally, and we think that the acquisition of the external things, the parigraha of external things, will make us happy, that's a misplaced understanding of where happiness is. The Dharma traditions all agree that we cannot ultimately get happy by gaining external things, because rather than happiness being external to us, happiness is ultimately within us. And so from the Jain theory, we have the potential in our soul to feel infinite happiness, but that potential has been restricted by our past karma. So the full expression of the essential happiness of our soul is obscured by karma, and that's why we feel incomplete. That's why we have desire and look externally. That's why we try to gain external things to make ourselves feel complete. But ultimately, in the process of trying to gain external things, we create more karma, which further restricts the full potential and the full expression of our eternal happiness. So the locus of happiness is not external, it's internal to us. And as long as we think it's external, we consume. And in the process of consuming, whether it's education, whether it's food, whether it's new car, new house, new job, making more money, anything we consume, nicer clothes, the more possessions, the more acquisitions we have, the more violence we create. Because no matter what we are consuming, somewhere on the supply chain, there's been an act of violence. Even the most ethical products that we can consume, there's still violence in the production. If I consume, the best plant foods that create the lowest karma, there's still the tilling of soil that kills animals. There's still the transportation, which uses fossil fuels and destroys the environment. No matter what we do, of course, we're directed to make the most nonviolent choices that we can, but any consumption at all is going to have some violence associated with it. So the more we look to external sources of happiness, and the more we engage in external acquisition, the more we actually create more karma that then restricts the full expression of the happiness which really resides within. And that is sort of the general pandharmic model. There's a disagreement about whether there's an essential soul or not. amongst Dharma traditions, but the idea that happiness does not exist by external acquisition is agreed upon by all of the Dharma traditions. So why is it that gaining things external to us doesn't ultimately make us happy? Why is that a misplaced understanding of where happiness resides? Well, first of all, no matter what we get, it's here today, gone tomorrow, right? So if I get, just to be ridiculous about this, if I get 10 units of happiness from my new car, or if I get 10 units of happiness from having a child, or 10 units of happiness from this delicious meal that I've eaten, because it's here today and gone tomorrow, I'll ultimately lose it. I'll have a proportional degree of suffering when that thing is lost. So if I gain some pleasantness when I gain something, when I lose it, I'll gain roughly equal amount of sadness, of pain. And so because of the impermanence of all things, anything that we consume that's external to us, and I mean things like, education, knowledge, television, but it can be material things like food, clothing, all of those things are here today, gone tomorrow, and as they leave, they cause us pain. The other peculiar thing about desire is it seems to be unquenchable. I think if you reflect on your lives, you can notice that there are times where you get what you wanted, and your satisfaction lasts a short time, but then you just want more. And then you want more, and you want more, and you want more. And the frustration of constantly wanting more makes it so that external sources of happiness are always going to ultimately cause frustration. So really what we need to realize is that happiness is internal and it's independent of external circumstances. And if we can understand that, then we can be happy irrespective of the vicissitudes of life. If I gain something, I can be happy, but if I lose something, I can also be happy because I know happiness is not in gain and loss. Happiness is independent of external circumstances. And that is a finding that all of the Dharma traditions have. And if we don't understand that, then we suffer. So we can illustrate this in the cycle of samsara with this following chart that I've made. Let me try to move this thing over. There we go. Okay, so here's how the cycle of samsara works. We're born into the world, we feel incomplete, right? From the Jain tradition, that's because the full expression of the essential goodness of our soul is restricted by karma, so we feel incomplete. So therefore we have desire. In the process of feeling desire to get something to feel more complete, we look to external consumption. But because no matter what we consume will create some violence, it will create more karma, which will further restrict the full expression of our essential goodness. And in the process of gaining more and more karma, then we owe a debt. We have to pay for all of the damage that we've done because justice in this model is part of reality. Justice is not just a social construct to help society be harmonious. Justice is part of reality. You can believe in justice or not believe in justice, it doesn't matter. You're still going to reap the fruits of your actions. So because you gain karma, you get reincarnated, and you again are born into the world feeling incomplete, and the cycle goes around and around and around, and we have the cycle of reincarnation that you can see illustrated here. So this is an agreement on all the Dharma traditions. Now, if you notice this cycle of samsara, there are multiple different links, and if we find the weak link, we can break the cycle. And the Dharma traditions tend to agree that the weak link is desire. That if we can address and we can mitigate and attenuate and eventually eradicate our desire for external sources of quote unquote happiness, then we can break the cycle. We can stop the consumption. Once we don't desire, we no longer consume. If we don't consume, we don't get karma. If we don't have karma, we don't reincarnate. And then we don't feel incomplete. And so finally, the absence of suffering allows for the full expression of the happiness which is within us. So that's sort of a basic agreement that we have with the Dharma traditions. And I basically illustrated it here. So therefore, the idea is that we end the desire so that we don't become subject to these various different reasons why external things cause us suffering. All right, so how do you eliminate worldly desire? Again, this is back to the application. So eliminating desire, yeah, it sounds good in theory. And if you just agree with me and you nod your head and say that makes sense, it doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to remove your karma. You actually have to apply this. You have to be able to figure out tangible ways of eliminating your worldly desire. So one of them is to address the question of koham. This is a question that the Dharma traditions ask. Who and what am I? And they see the problem of karma is being related to a problem of identity. So for example, if I believe that I'm my external relationships, if I identify with my bodily relationships alone, then I'm going to have more desire. And then the whole problem of karma, et cetera, continues. So let me illustrate this. My external bodily identities, I have a job, I have a socioeconomic status, I have a gender, I have an ethnicity, I have a profession. All of those things, my family status involves relationships, external relationships, right? My job all involves external relationships. My gender involves external relationships. All of those things are things that are external to the soul. And as long as I think that I'm my job, I'm my gender, I'm my socioeconomic status, I'm my ethnicity, I'm my religion, as long as I identify with my body, which is caused by my karma, then I'm going to identify with external things that are external to my soul. And as long as I'm identifying with that which is external to my soul, I'm going to think that to get happy, I have to gain external things. I have to be a better family member. I have to get a better job. I have to get my promotion. I have to, do all of these things. And in the process, I create more consumption, right? So number one, to stop your desire, you have to understand your identity, that you are not your karma, you're not your external bodily identity, but you're actually a soul that's independent of external relationships, and therefore you can be happy irrespective of these external relationships, and you don't have to have desire and you don't have to consume. Now, the Dharma traditions also agree there's a lot of different ways that we can reorient our identity, but if you sit and you meditate, and there's multiple different ways to meditate, what you will do is you will explore and you will examine the structures of your consciousness or pure consciousness itself. And you'll come to realize, you'll come to experience self-realization, to get a direct experience of your, in the Jain tradition, of your soul. And as you start to get a direct realization of your soul, you no longer identify with what's external, and you no longer pursue external sources of happiness, which create karma and actually restrict the full expression of your soul. So this is how it works. You have to realize your true identity as a soul through meditation. Now, of course, not all Dharma traditions believe in a soul, so that's different, but they do all agree that we have to examine that we are not our karma by using various different meditative actions, and therefore, when we realize we're not our karma, we stop our worldly desire. Now, another way that we can stop our worldly desire is by practicing austerity, tapas or tapasya. Now, it's very easy to think that we have eradicated our worldly desire when we're comfortable, right? So if I'm comfortable, my house is warm, I just had a nice meal, I slept really well, I have enough money, and I can say, wow, I have no desire. Maybe I eradicated worldly desire, right? Well, that's not a very good test for whether you've eradicated worldly desire. Actually, the test is to put yourself in a situation of discomfort, all right? So if you can be without food, if you can be uncomfortable, if you can do something that's difficult, something you don't necessarily want to do because it's not necessarily comfortable and pleasant, if you can do something that's uncomfortable and not pleasant and still have no desire and still be happy, then you've realized that the source of happiness is not external. You've addressed the issue of desire if you can be happy without any external engagements, without external comforts, and you can be happy independent of that. And the way you do that is you impose self-imposed difficulty on yourself. And there's multiple different ways that you can do this. You as college students have some idea of how this works, right? So the idea is the self-difficulty that you impose on yourself teaches you that you can be happy independent of external circumstances. And because of that, there's actually a generative power. When you engage in austerity, it generates something, it creates something within you. And that creation is the process of burning off karma. For example, as a student, perhaps maybe you would rather watch television all day or go have fun with your friends or go hang out with your family. Or I know the beautiful beaches of the Philippines are so wonderful. I was there in, I think, 1997, and I was on these beautiful beaches. Wouldn't you rather be on the beach than in a classroom? Right? Well, no, you impose self-imposed difficulty by sitting in front of the computer screen and learning. And it can be difficult when you're missing out on some recreation and this other thing, but you do it because you know you're going to get something out of the deal. If you deny yourself that pleasure of recreation and comfort, you're going to generate intelligence. Same way, if we deny ourselves the comfort of unhealthy food and we eat healthy food, we're going to generate health. And so this is part of how the principle of austerity works, is that we realize that we can be happy no matter what our external circumstances are. We can be happy and therefore challenge our desires and be independent of our desires. And in the process, that generates things within us. It makes us a stronger, more powerful person when we challenge our comfort zones. And so that's part of what's happening with the austerity. And in the process, you're refraining from consumption. So every time you engage in some sort of austerity, there's some sort of type of consumption that you're refraining from. And if you're refraining from consumption, you're not creating karma. The karma is not restricting the full expression of your internal goodness. And therefore, as that karma stops coming towards you and adhering to you, you burn off the old karma. And eventually the inner goodness that you are is allowed a fuller expression, and you're able to be more feeling complete, more happy. And that's really how the theory of austerity works. Okay, so let me just run down a difference between the Dharma traditions. And Dr. Pandey addressed this just a little bit here, but this is a really quick rundown of the differences. So I went over some of the similarities with the Dharma traditions, but let's look at the differences here, all right? So we can ask ourselves whether the Dharma traditions believe in a monotheistic God, that there is a single God that's omnipotent, omnipresent, omnibenevolent, omniscient, the basic definition of what a God is. Abrahamic traditions have this, Dharmic traditions have this as well too. Is there a monotheistic God? Now the Hindus will all answer yes. And I say all qualified because there's always an exception, but generally Hindus will all say yes, there's a monotheistic God. Hindus will argue about whether God has a personality or whether God is more like a principle, but they still agree on this sort of monotheistic model. All right. Buddhists, and we're mostly talking about Indian Buddhists here, it gets a little different in East Asian Buddhism. Indian Buddhists will deny that there's a God. They'll say there is no monotheistic God, particularly in a lot of the Sanskrit literature and the Pali literature of Indian Buddhism will very strongly refute the idea of a God. And then the Jains will also agree that there is no monotheistic God. The locus of power, the locus of value is not external to us, but rather it's within the soul of every being. And so the locus of what Jains consider to be sacred and worshipable is not some external God, but it's really the potential that each living being has, which is why the necessity for nonviolence. If you don't have a monotheistic God and the locus of that which is sacred is within every being, then you better not hurt any beings, because that would be tantamount to heresy or blasphemy, or it'd be a crime against God, if what is most sacred is within each being. So this is how the Dharma traditions answer the God question. Now, the other one is whether there's an eternal soul that can be experienced apart from karma. Well, for Hindus, they will say, yes, there is an eternal soul. And once again, the Hindus will all argue about whether the soul's separate from God, whether it's one with God, whether it's both one and separate from God. They'll all argue about what it means to have an individual, to have an eternal soul. But Hindus generally agree that there is a God, there is a soul. Now, Buddhists, again, Indian Buddhists in particularly, will say that there's no God and no soul. And then the Jains will say, yes, there's an eternal soul, but there's no God. And so this is just a really quick way that we can sort of gain an orientation of the three different Dharmic traditions. And we can see that Jains are unique and that we have eternal soul, yet no God. And that's an important thing here. Now, there's traditions, we can see they disagree on that. They also disagree on what to do. If you could kindly mute your microphones, I would appreciate that, please. The Dharma traditions disagree about what to do about the problem of karma. They agree that karma is a problem. Please mute. Please mute. Hello. All right. Okay, we're good. Everybody's muted. All right, thank you. So even though the Dharma traditions all agree on the problem of karma and reincarnation, as I've laid it out, they have a different idea of what to do about that problem. So since Hindus tend to believe that there's some version of a monotheistic God, to stop this sense of false identity and desire and karma that I've laid out, there's a certain element of grace that happens in Hinduism. And grace in this context can be thought of as debt forgiveness. So as I said, karma creates a debt. And from a Hindu perspective, that debt is so immense that you can never really wear off that debt. At some point, there has to be divine intervention to absolve you from that debt. And so the idea that you can be absolved from your karma, it makes it so that you're just, I want to say you're a little less attentive to karma and a little bit more attentive to how to receive the grace that will absolve you from karma. And with the Jain tradition, because there's no absolution, you have to be much more attentive to your karma because nobody's ever going to forgive that debt. Again, that's one of the reasons why the Jains have a unique emphasis of nonviolence, is because you have to deal with your karma. There's no absolution. Now with Buddhists, there's a similar sort of idea that it's very, very hard to ever eradicate all your karmic debt. But what the Buddhists say, particularly Indian Buddhists, is that if you realize that you have no soul, then the sort of thing that glues all of your karma together, that gives you an illusion of this external karmic self, will start to dissolve. And once that illusion of a self dissolves, you're liberated from karma. So for Buddhists, Indian Buddhists particularly, when you realize that you need to really experience in like states of meditation or through philosophy, but you have to realize that there is no soul. You have no self that endures across time. And as you realize that, then you no longer identify with your karma. You no longer have the greed to create more karma, and therefore your karma dissolves and you become free from karma. So for Hinduism, there's a lot of emphasis on grace. There's karmic forgiveness. With Buddhists, there's a lot of emphasis on realizing that you don't have a soul to eradicate karma. And then for Jains, there really is no other way other than dealing with your own karma. You absolutely must deal with it. It's what Dr. Pandey referred to as shrama, right? Shrama is it's your own effort. So as you guys, sounds like you're all very familiar with Catholic theology or Christian theology. There's a sort of dichotomy between salvation by grace, salvation by works. Of course, Catholics accept both salvation by grace and by works. We can see that the Jains very much are salvation by works alone, if we were going to put it into Catholic terms, for example. So the traditions agree on the problem, they disagree on the solution. That's really how that works. Okay, so let's look a little closer at Jain metaphysics to see how this all works. Again, Jains have no God, there's an eternal soul. We have to engage in austerity to stop the accumulation of karma, to stop the karmic influx, to remove karma, and also to extinguish our desire. So we have to engage in austerity for all of those reasons. Now, some of you, it sounds like a lot of you have done some philosophy, that's great. So you might be familiar with these terms. There's various different ways that we can describe reality. And there's various different propositions. Ontological monism is the idea that all things are essentially the same thing. An example of ontological monism is what's called scientific materialism. Scientific materialism believes that everything is made out of this thing called matter. All things are permutations of matter. And that's monism. All things are this one substance, matter, right? Now, there's other forms of monism where you say all things are sort of parts of God. Right, that's a theistic monism, which is a lot of Hindu schools have that type of monism. Well, Jains are ontological pluralists, which is the idea that there's multiple categories of things and there's multiple different sub things within those categories. So those three categories are known as dravyas. The first of those is that which is non-material and sentient, which you guessed it is your soul. Your soul is not made out of matter and it's sentient. The second thing is that which is material and non-sentient, and that's matter in the classical sense of what you think of as matter. And then there's this other category. Oh, and by the way, karma is considered material as well too. So when we identify with karma, we're identifying with something that we're actually not. We think we're material when we think we're our bodily identities, right? And then the third category is that which is non-material and non-sentient. We can think of things that are not material but are real. Things like mathematical principles, right? Motion, stillness, time. Think about time, for example. It's not material, it's not sentient, but it is real. And so these are three categories of reality for Jain ontological pluralism. And of course, what's particularly important here is the relationship between the first two, right? Is our soul's relationship to matter and how that matter causes karmic influx. And that's what's particularly important when it comes to the idea of nonviolence. Okay, so here we can see an illustration of how this works. So this dust cloud is karma, this likened to a dust cloud, right? So in our daily actions, we're creating actions that will have reactions. And we can think about that as like being in a dusty room and kicking up the dust, right? Now, if we are sticky, let's say we're sweating, then what's going to happen with that dust? It's going to stick to us, right? And it's going to make us uncomfortable. It's not going to make us feel like we're complete, right? So similar in our daily actions, we create all of this action, right? And if we have desire being the idea that something external can make us happy. If we have that misplaced understanding of happiness, then that karma that we're kicking up in our daily actions is going to stick to the soul, and it's going to restrict the full expression of the essential goodness of the soul. And the soul has these three qualities. The soul is pure consciousness, it's pure energy, and it's pure happiness. And so, as I've kind of illustrated, the more karma sticks to us, the less we feel the full range of our consciousness, the less we feel the full range of our energy, and the less we feel the full range of our happiness. And so that's really how the model works in terms of karma. Okay, so you philosophers out there, you're familiar with the term epistemology. Epistemology is the study of gaining knowledge. How do we gain knowledge? And then how do you describe warrant, right? Whether something's a justified true belief, etc. So with Jain epistemology, I like to put this karma theory in terms of epistemology. So in many of us in modern academy, are influenced by the scientific method. We learn the scientific method very early on in school, and we don't really learn very many other theories of knowledge, which is kind of a failure of our education system unless we study philosophy. But we can think about Jain Dharma as having a research question, right? And the type of research question you have is going to determine what your answer will be. So for example, if you're asking what is real, are you asking what is real from a lens that only analyzes objective empirical data? If you're asking what's real, but you stipulate we can only examine objective empirical data, which is what modern science does, then our model of reality is going to look one way. But if we ask what is real, but we admit broader ranges of data, say data that includes the structures of our consciousness, then we're going to get another very different model of what reality is. It's not that one model's right and the other's wrong, but based on the nature of our research question, we're going to have a different idea of what is real and what reality is. So the research question, the main research question that Jainism is asking is, what's the best method that will liberate us from the suffering inherent in the material world that I've laid up? What is the thing we can do to free ourselves from suffering? This is known as Mukti Marga, the path of liberation. What's the proper Mukti Marga, the path to salvation? That is the main question. So all other answers, all other things in Jain philosophy are specifically designed to answer this research question. What is Mukti Marga? What is the path of liberation? And so to answer those questions, Jain philosophers have come up with various different methods that can address the research question. And so the research question is Mukti Marga. The research methods are known as the 3 jewels or the Ratnatraya, right? The 3 jewels. Now, these research methods include the first one, Samyak Dardarshana, which is having the proper perception, the proper outlook, the proper philosophy, the proper faith. Dardarshana is a complicated term. It kind of means all of those things, right? So if we're going to find out how to liberate ourselves from suffering, we need to have a right perception and correct faith, right? We have to trust in the correct streams of data, for example. We have to have a right knowledge, jnana, philosophical, be rational thinkers, not be easily deluded, those kinds of things as well too. And then the third of these that I'm going to lean in pretty heavily, given the topic of this seminar, is samyak charitra, right? If we are going to understand how we can liberate ourselves from suffering, one of the research methods that we're going to have to follow is right conduct, ethical behavior, moral behavior. And that's how we are going to understand. So all three of these research methods are going to provide a stream of data that we can then analyze and then understand what choices we should make that will free us from suffering. And that's really how we can think about the Jain tradition. So each one of those are research methods. And I'm going to focus in on that last one there, samyak charitra, right conduct. And the proposition here is that ethical behaviors, you don't just do the right thing because you're supposed to, people expect it of you, society works better because of it. Those are reasons to do the right thing. But in this case, I'm going to look at what it means to do the right thing because it will give you knowledge of how to free yourself from suffering. All right. So the proposition here is that the evidence for the truth claims made by Jain philosophy, if you want the data that supports the truth claims of Jain philosophy, you have to engage in first-person experience. You have to verify the teachings of the tradition by your own lived experience. Unless you practice Jain Dharma, you don't have access to the data that supports the truth claims of Jain Dharma. And we could say this is probably true for most religions. If you want to assess whether the truth claims of a tradition, any religion, is true, we have to understand that the majority of the data that supports religious truth claims comes from the lived experience one has from within that tradition. That is to say, if you are not engaged in the lived experience of the tradition, you do not have access to the data that supports the truth claim of those traditions, and therefore you're in a very weak position to assess whether a particular tradition is true or not. Okay, so if you want the data to support the truth of the teachings of Jain Dharma, you have to follow the prescriptions of Jain Dharma to have access to that data. And number one prescription, as Dr. Pandey so kindly pointed out, is living non-violently as much as you possibly can. So without the element of practice, you don't have access to the data that supports Jain philosophy is the basic point here. And so the way we access that data that's provided by the lived experience in that tradition is we avoid vices and we follow virtues, right? Doshas and vratatas. And this is very similar to the 7 deadly sins and the 7 virtues in Christianity that we see as well too. And we do this based on the stations of our life. Dr. Pandey pointed out that, we have different abilities based on where we are in life. If I'm a householder and if I have children, it's going to be much harder for me to consume less if I have to provide for those children. So I have to consume a lot more as a parent because I have to consume things that will help my children, right? So I'm accountable for more karmic load if I have children, for example. Or let's say that I'm a business person and a lot of people depend on me for their employment. I can't just walk away from that duty because that would be doing violence to those people. But in the process of being the employer, I'm engaged in a larger karmic load. So we have various different capacities to be able to engage in the restriction of consumption based on our stations and our abilities in life. So the basic point here is the reason why nonviolence is so central to the tradition is that all vices are related to violence. Something is a vice because somehow somebody's getting hurt. And then all virtue is related to nonviolence. Anything you do is a virtue because somehow you are making the choice to take the path of least violence. We can't always take a path of absolutely no violence, but we can always weigh our decisions and figure out what the path of least violence is, and that's what nonviolence is. So therefore, if you're going to understand the philosophy of the Jain tradition, if you're going to access the data that supports the truth claims of Jain philosophy, you must live a nonviolent life. Anytime there's any choice you make, where you do anything, how you leave the house, how you drive, how you eat, what you buy, all of those things you need to be weighing. Is there a less violent way of doing this? And if you're constantly asking yourself that question, then you're starting to get an access to the data that supports the religious truth claims. Because in Jain terms and Jain metaphysics, the more you do that, the more you reduce the amount of karma that you're inviting in, the more you're operating without desire. You're not making choices based on your desire. You're making choices based on what's right. And therefore, you're mitigating your desire, so the karma is not sticking to you. Karma is not coming in, karma is not sticking, and therefore, the full expression of the essential goodness of your soul is allowed a greater expression. So you feel greater happiness, greater levels of consciousness, greater levels of energy. And that's how it works. So the research question is, how do we free ourselves from suffering? And the research answer is practicing nonviolence. And as you do that, you will learn the truth of that. All right, so let's get a little philosophical here. I heard a couple people were third year philosophy students, and I'm going to take advantage of this a little bit here. So this is a system that we might call ethical realism. This is very important in our modern age because arguably the predominant form of morality, what people believe about morality, is anti-realism, right? That morality is just a matter of opinion or personal taste. It might be right for me, and it might be wrong for you. Who's to say? I like it, therefore it's right. You don't like it, therefore it's wrong. There's no essential quality of reality that's right or wrong. It's just a matter of personal taste. That's ethical anti-realism. That's very much a part of modern history, influenced by Euro-American intellectual history, and it's increasingly becoming prominent across the world, right? With multiple different anti-realist movements, positivism, postmodernism. Some of this stuff is related and comes out of pragmatism, like John Dewey and that sort of thing as well too. But of course, this goes back to David Hume and all of those, for those of you people who have studied the philosophy. So we can ask ourselves to define ethical realism. Are ethical qualities real? Is the rightness or the wrongness of a class of actions, is that just a matter of personal taste? Is it the society just constructs this model, this constructionism? That we're going to say that this is right and this is wrong because we think this is going to create a harmonious society, right? Or I'm going to say this is right or this is wrong because I like it or I don't like it, right? Is that what rightness or wrongness is? Is it just something that people make up? They construct in their own minds, they construct societally? Or is there some objective rightness or wrongness? For example, violence. Is violence wrong whether you agree with it or not? We could say nonviolence doesn't care what you believe. Karma doesn't care what you believe. If I engage in violence, I'm going to get violent results, irrespective of what I believe, because karma is objectively real. If karma was not objectively real, then you would expect the result to be based on whatever you believe. If you don't believe this is wrong, then it's not wrong. If you believe this is wrong, you don't believe it's wrong, right? But ethical realism is that the quality of an action is objectively right or wrong, whether you believe in it or not. So if ethics are not real, then why should we follow it? William James posits this question. Alasdair MacIntyre posits this question. What does it mean? If we want to understand the meaning of a philosophy, it's called a pragmatic maxim. If we want to understand the meaning of a philosophy, what does it mean in action? If people don't believe that morality is real and it's just a matter of personal taste, if that's what society believes, what kind of society do we produce? One that destroys the environment, one that exploits animals, one where people who are not of a social economic status are treated badly. That's the kind of society you expect if we don't believe that morality is real, right? So this is very, very potentially problematic. Whether you believe in ethical realism, believe in ethical anti-realism, will create a paradigm which is going to create a model for how people live. So the stakes could not be higher here. So anti-realism is relativism. It's the idea that something might be that all truth statements about rightness and wrongness are of equal value, right? What's right by one culture might be wrong by another based on constructionism. Okay, that's what relativism is. There's a lot of versions of relativism. We can see like emotivism is a form of relativism, et cetera, in case you guys are familiar with some of these things. But then ethical realism is the idea that right or wrong is objectively true, independent of the opinions of cultures or subjective tastes, et cetera. So for those people who are skeptical of the idea that morality is real, it's objectively real, I would pose the question of violence to children. So, and this is a common sense argument, right? So are you really willing to commit to the idea that violence for children is a matter of personal taste and social construction? That means if society decides that violence to children is not wrong, does that mean that violence to children is not wrong, right? Or that's an anti-realist position. The realist position would be that violence to children is wrong no matter what, okay? And then we know this because when we see it happen, we feel it in our gut. We feel it in our structures of consciousness. There's an emotion that we feel when we witness violence to children. And that emotion is not just a mental construction, it's a sensory perception. We can see something, we can hear something, and we can feel something. And when we feel something is wrong, because that sense is just as much sensory perception as your vision, it's just as reliable as your own sight. So that's the phenomenological argument, right? And so this is really what the argument is with Jain Dharma, is that you can sense what's right and what's wrong. You just know, right? So karma theory implies ethical realism, that karma is real, whether you believe in it or not, and therefore it's a position of karma realism, okay? And so that's how we can understand the Jain tradition, is that whether we believe in karma or not, we can witness the results of karma. If you don't believe in karma, try it out. Go be mean to everybody all the time, and you'll find that you have less opportunities and more people who want to hurt you. You go out and you be kind and compassionate to people all the time, you're going to find that you have more people who want to help you, and you're going to have more opportunities in life. You can test the theory of karma, and based on what the experiment will yield, you can decide whether it's true or not. So karma is real whether you believe it or not, because if we engage in that type of experiment, we're all going to get the same results because it's objectively real, irrespective of our personal opinions. So we can infer that karma is real, okay? So the basic idea is that we're going to replace virtue, replace vice with virtue, and that's how we're going to deliver ourselves from suffering. Okay. Now that's how we look at karma theory as ethical realism. Another way that we can look at karma theory, and the Jain karma theory in particular, is in the lens of virtue ethics. For those of you who read Alistair MacIntyre, for example. So the idea with the virtue ethic is that we have a potential in our soul, like an essence of what we are, and that potential is being restricted. And with certain types of behavior, that potential can be given full expression. That's really how virtue ethics works, is that there's an ideal state that's represented by our essence. In the Jain tradition, that ideal state is pure consciousness, pure energy, and pure happiness. And we have that as our essence. And therefore, it's an ideal to which we are ever aspiring. You could even say that we are lured towards that essence as an ideal. We're trying to discover this unblemished moral character of our soul, and we're lured towards it. Now, you might ask, but what about people who do things that are wrong, that are unethical? Well, they too are lured by realizing the ideal essence of their soul, which is happiness. People who hurt and do violence are trying to get happy. So we are all trying to realize the potential of our soul to be happy. But some of us are doing it the right way through nonviolence, et cetera. Others are going about it all wrong by engaging in acts of violence and external consumption, et cetera. And so this way we can see that this is a model of virtue ethics, where the essence of the person is the ideal to which you aspire, whether you are doing the right thing or not, right? And so that's the basic model of how we can see it is a virtue ethic, okay? So now there's another issue here that comes up for ethicists, and this is the issue of the theory-praxis divide. So it's very frustrating being an ethicist, I know, because there's this, somebody will come up with this great ethical theory, and if everybody followed it, life would be perfect for everyone, right? We'd have this harmonious utopia. But then no matter what ethical theory people come up with, nobody follows, nobody listens to the ethicists. So there's this idea that you can come up with an ethical theory, but what people actually do, it's not clear how a theory will impel practice. Think about in your own life. You know what's right, but do you always do what's right? Like, you know you should eat healthy, but then you eat unhealthy. You know you should exercise, but then you sit around being lazy. You know you should do your homework, but then you watch television. You know, we know what's right, but we don't always do that. Well, this is the theory-praxis divide in ethics. It's a common sort of problem that ethicists have to deal with. Well, I would point out that the Jain tradition has dealt with the theory-practice divide by framing ethics, as we saw with Dr. Pandey's lecture, that these are not just ethical theories, but these are commitments. They're framed as not just ideals, but they're vows. Like, you are going to vow to engage, to always make the less violent choice. You're going to make a vow to tell the truth. You're going to make the vow to not steal. You're going to make a vow to consume as little as possible and to live simply, right? All of those are vows. And if you make a vow, then it's not just a theory, it demands action, right? And so that's how the Jain tradition has sort of solved that ethical problem as well, too. So vows are themselves a form of austerity, because if you think about what a vow is, you're deciding not to do the comfortable thing, not to do the pleasant thing, but instead you're going to restrict your behavior from that which is comfortable and that which is pleasant to that which is right and that which is good. So vows are inherently linked to a type of austerity. It's a self-imposed difficulty you have. And so everything I said about the benefit of austerity being a destroying of karma and stopping the inflow of karma, all of that applies to when you're taking a vow to choose the pleasant over the good, for example, replacing virtue with vice, okay? So this is a transformational process. So we can look at the relationship between virtues and vices here, doshas and vratas. And again, notice that this is not just virtue, but these are vows that you make to engage in virtuous behavior. And Dr. Pandey listed a lot of these, but I'll go over them a little bit quickly before I do just one little last thing here. So the number one vice is violence. That which makes everything else right or wrong is the degree of violence, right? And then the chief vrata, the chief vow virtue, to address that is the vow of nonviolence. And then the same thing with truthfulness, untruthfulness, stealing, non-stealing, sexual urges, vow of sexual restraint, brahmacharya, but as Dr. Pandey pointed out, this can also be svadartha santosha, right? Being content with one's partner, monogamy, etc. But still, the idea is that sexuality is a form of consumption. It's a way that you expend energy externally, directed away from spiritual pursuits. And so there's always a spiritual opportunity cost when we engage in sexual behavior as well, too. So it should be restricted. And then, of course, consumption versus non-consumption. All right. So, and again, as Dr. Pandey pointed out, this is going to be different for householders versus those who are mendicants, or full ascetics, and that's pretty much what we see, okay? So just to point out nonviolence, I think Dr. Pandey did a very good job explaining the various different types of nonviolence. As I put it in terms of a virtue ethic, this is a vehicle for human evolution and progress and spiritual awakening, and that nonviolence is the ultimate goal of the Jain tradition, as you all have learned. Now, the last one that I do want to cover a little bit is this other one, aparigraha. This is non-consumption, right? And I think this one is, you can see it down there on the bottom of the list right here. I think this one is the most important in terms of the modern era. Of course, it's important only because it's a form of nonviolence. Nonviolence is the most important. But I think that we need to pay particular attention to aparigraha because of its relationship to structural violence. I think in the past, in the pre-modern era, most forms of violence, most ethics, most moral behavior was interpersonal. It dealt with how you deal with people around you. But because of global capitalism and globalism, we have structures that are global in the institutionalization of the European Enlightenment that turns into Industrial Revolution. mercantilism, colonialism, and then global capitalism, these sort of intricate networks and institutions of human behavior are much more structural than they were in pre-modern times. So when we're investigating nonviolence or ethical behavior, I think that we shouldn't just focus on our interpersonal relationships, but we should look at global networks of institutional structures of violence as well too. So structural violence are forms of violence that are collective. That means we are all engaged in it. That means that we all benefit from it and we all contribute to it. Think of something like using plastic, right? Nobody here is responsible solely for plastic. Plastic is a world that we were raised in. It's hard, it would be impossible to restructure our world at this point tomorrow without plastic. None of us is individually accountable, but we are all accountable because we all engage in violence by our consumption of plastic, which leads to pollution, which leads to destruction of habitats, and the extinction of species, et cetera, right? We all benefit from plastic. We're not individually responsible, but yet we all are individually responsible. It's a form of structural violence. We all are collectively benefiting from a system of violence, fossil fuels, for example, that none of us created. We inherited this system of violence, but nonetheless, we all benefit from it. So we all owe a karmic debt for our structural violence, right? And these forms of structural violence are upheld by our social institutions, and we participate in them whether we know it or not. So some examples of these are the oppression and domination of other species of life, the environment, the subjugation of women, the subjugation of people of color, global racism, the sort of denial of equal rights to LGBTQI community, colonialism, Western hegemony. All of these are forms of structural violence, ways that we all either suffer from these or we benefit from these. And arguably, we all do a little bit of both. And therefore, we all have a certain karmic debt to these structural systems beyond just our daily interpersonal relationships. The very way that we live, the very fact that I'm a human being in a modern era, that, particularly because I'm in a wealthy country, I suffer, because wealth in a wealthy country is created by draining wealth out of poorer countries. The reason why there's rich countries is because there's poor countries. It's a function of colonialism. Right? And global capitalism is our newest form of colonialism. It's the way that rich countries like the one I'm in will drain resources from poorer countries. And so therefore, because I'm benefiting from being in a rich country, I have a heavier karmic load, right? I have a greater debt. And that's a form of structural violence. So the target of our moral philosophy has to go beyond just individual virtues, and it has to address structural violence, right? And I would note that all of these types of structural violence that I've mentioned are related to global capitalism, which is related to consumerism. What is global capitalism? It's how business gets rich by providing products for consumers, right? That's where all structural violence has that one thing in common, is it's a function of global capitalism. All right. So if we consume beyond our basic needs, you have a basic need for transportation, for food, for clothing. If you have more food than you need, more clothing than you need, if you're consuming more resources than you need, right, beyond your basic comfort, then you're contributing excessively to forms of structural violence. So therefore, the way to disengage from that is to engage in non-consumption, in simplicity, and the parigraha that Dr. Pandey so nicely elaborated, right? So global distribution of wealth as a function of this, Dr. Pandey pointed that out as well too. He noted the link between a parigraha and economic inequality, which is also something that Gandhi very much focused on. The more I consume, the less other people have, right? So global distribution of power, of wealth, that can be rectified by consuming less. Global warfare, particularly I'm in the United States. Whatever American consumer wants, our military will go out and make that happen. We want more gas, we go to war with the Middle East and make sure we get that gas, right? And we're not the first to do it. The British did it before the United States does. But warfare itself is a function, the military arm of any government is very much tied to the consumption and the businesses and the profiteering of those who have wealth in the society. Of course, environmentalism is related to consumerism because we consume things that create waste, it creates energy to produce, and that sort of thing. And then, of course, animal suffering is a huge part of consumerism. We can choose food products that have more suffering, or we can choose food products that have less suffering. So Dr. Pandey was very explicit about the different sensory capacities that different beings have. Animals have 5 sense capacities. So if we commit acts of violence to animals, their ability to suffer is much greater than if we eat plants. This is why vegetarianism is mandatory for Jains, is because you create more violence when you eat animal products. And then increasingly, there's a movement towards global veganism in the Jain community as well, too, because we realize that dairy products, cow milk, usually the cows are invariably killed for that. So most of the hamburger you eat comes from dairy cows. And so milk is basically a form of what we might call liquid meat, right? So we're enjoined to choose less suffering by choosing plant products. So that's another thing. And then there's also other ways that animals are exploited by testing and food and clothing, et cetera. So we can engage in aparigraha in 2 ways. We can avoid working in certain fields. Like I wouldn't want to work in weapons production, and I wouldn't want to work in like plastics or, things that create like excessive amount of destruction and harm. And then as consumers, we can be careful what we consume. And all of that's going to be applications of nonviolence. So you can see this basic formula in the Jain Dharma is the relationship between austerity, virtue, and nonviolence, and how that relates to our karma theory. But very much at the center of that is this idea of nonviolence, and we have to deal with our karma. And Jain tradition does this in a lot of different ways. Again, Dr. Pandey pointed out the mask that Jain ascetics wear so that they're not inhaling microscopic organisms. There's like a peacock breath, where you would be very careful before you sit down or do anything that you're not going to hurt any organisms. And then there's various different ways that this gets demonstrated. There's a sect of Jainism that doesn't wear clothing, because if you think about clothing is a form of consumption, there's resources that are created, that are used to create clothing. And anytime you're consuming, there's some violence happening on the supply chain. So arguably, it's less violent to not wear any clothing. That's just another way that happens. And then, of course, the relationship between Jain Dharma and diet, vegetarianism, and increasingly veganism. Okay, so I think I've covered a lot of applications of Jain nonviolence, and I'm going to go ahead and conclude there. And then we can take questions, I believe, for both Dr. Pandey and myself. Thank you for your attention, and I hope that was illuminating and was a good discourse on the Jain tradition and nonviolence application.
Okay, so all right. Thank you, Dr. Kojan. That was actually a very comprehensive presentation. After all what has been discussed by Dr. Kojan, I think we as audiences has to be reminded of what he mentioned earlier, that it is not enough just to know what the Jain way of living is. It is not enough just to have the knowledge of what this particular concept of Ahimsa is. We have to practice it in order to live it. There is the necessity to practice in order to actualize the Jain way of living of nonviolence. All right, so before we proceed with the question and answer, I guess we can take a short break. Let's have a 3 to 5 minutes break. So for my time here, it's now 11:01 a.m. So everyone, please come back at 11:06 a.m. with your questions. So thank you. All right, so welcome back everyone. I hope okay na tayo. Okay, so let us begin. Let us proceed with the question and answer portion. So you may raise your questions either by typing it in the chat feature of our Zoom meetings, or you may also raise your hand by clicking the participants action, I mean the reactions button, and then may feature then the raise hand button so that we can acknowledge you. Okay, so first question, anyone? Okay, so Mr. Kenneth, the way we begin our asking our question also is we have to state our name and then our affiliation, where we come from, and then to whom resource speaker are you addressing your question. So you may proceed, Mr. Kenneth.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. So I am Kenneth Gadian. I am a seminarian from St. Paul Seminary Foundation. I am fourth year AB Communication. So I actually have one question for Dr. Pandey and one question directed to Dr. Bohanek, if it is allowed. But they are most likely related questions. So I really love the presentations because right now here in the seminary and in the Catholics are practicing Lent, right? We're the season of Lent, and it is actually a season of withdrawal from desires. And I kind of agree with all the points. My question is, this is directed to Dr. Bohanek when he said, non-violence could, it appeals to me that it is mostly like negative ways. When say negative, not bad, but negations, restrictions, not doing something. So, however, that would be very, very doable if I am a monastic, for example. I am withdrawn from the world, right? Not to do all these things. So, if coming from a person, a household person in a modern world, I still want to go to school. I still want to travel. I still want to do good, for example, positive, proactive ways of doing good. And I cannot do this with desire as the motivation, right? Like having education with desire as motivation. So my question would be, what do I replace desire with? So if I remove desire as my motivation in going to school or in going to communities, in the context of Jain philosophy, Dr. Bohanek, what would you suggest that I replace desire with as a motivation?
Okay, yeah, what a wonderful, thoughtful question. You're a very, very bright student. I can tell. I'm sure your professors love you. So I can address all of these points. So first of all, it is true that people tend to think of Ahimsa as nonviolence as a negative. But I would point out that it's actually not a negative. It's the positive condition of the soul. If you think about the thing that restricts your soul, the full expression of the goodness of your soul, is karma, and karma is a form of violence, then really the full expression of your soul is the opposite of violence. Therefore, the full expression of your soul is nonviolence. So therefore, rather than replacing, so it's a very positive attribute. It really is what you're made of. You are happy when you are nonviolent. You are aware, you are conscious, you're at your best heightened consciousness when you are nonviolent. You have most energy, most potential, when you are nonviolent. So it very much is the force of what you are essentially as well too. And then it also is the supreme law of the universe. It's the governance of all living beings and their ability to achieve there. So it very much is a positive force as well too. And then the other thing that you're right, not everybody can be a mendicant. A lot of us are householders and we have to make certain choices. And so, we can think of good karma and bad karma, right? And I didn't really go into the difference of this, but bad karma are things are places where you could have made a less violent choice, but you made a more violent choice. That's going to be bad karma, right? Good karma is going to be where you were presented with two choices, and rather than the more violent choice, you went with the less violent choice. But even the less violent choice is some form of consumption, right? Like, for example, if I buy a meal and give it to somebody who's hungry, right? That's an expression of compassion. I'm going to get good karma from that. And but still the meal involved the violence of the production, the transportation, the agriculture, all of that. So there's still some violence with it, but on balance, it's a non-violence, and the karma is not going to stick to me as much because it's not based on selfish motivation, but it's based on selflessness, right? So what we're doing really is we're creating like a return on investment where we're calculating our actions in a way that choose less violence, and then the results that we will get from that will create better conditions where we can live more non-violently. For example, if you are starving to death and you live in a very, very violent sort of environment, domestic violence in like a neighborhood that's riddled with crime, and you have nothing and you're a hungry child, you're going to have to steal for a living. You might need to rob people for a living. It's going to be a lot harder to practice nonviolence in those kind of circumstances. But if you keep getting good karma, you can get into circumstances where it will be easier to practice nonviolence. The example that I used is that when I first went vegan, I was a cook in a restaurant, and it was a restaurant that served meat. So I had to prepare and feed people meat. And I had to do that because it was my livelihood. If I didn't do that, I would be homeless, and that would be an act of violence to myself. But because I had the intention to get out of it, I was eventually able to free myself and create, because my intention was that way, it wasn't based on desire. I abstained, and my karma got to such a point where I could finally get out of that. So that's another way that we can use karma as a return on desire. And then I think you really already answered your question as well too, is that the motivation is really going to be instrumental as well too. So the last thing I want to say is about replacing desire, that point you made. It's true. It's not necessarily, desire is an English word, right? This is not a word from India. So in English, we can have a bad desire or a good desire. Bad desire is selfish desire. Bad desire is when we choose our own comfort over the well-being of others. Bad desire is when we misplace the locus of happiness as external. And then good desire is when we have desire for spiritual uplifting, spiritual practice, the time we spend in our prayer or meditation, the time we spend reading scriptures, the time we spend trying to help others and cultivate compassion, the time we spend, all of those are forms of desiring our spiritual benefit. So if you're going to replace one with the other, you replace selfish desire for selfless and spiritually types of desire. Sorry, that was a long answer. I'm sure that Dr. Pandey has much to say about that too.
Thank you very much, sir. I have another question actually for Dr. Pandey. I think Dr. Bohanek has answered beautifully my question, and I took note of that. Dr. Pandey, my question is, in terms of non-violence, how about I will be violent against evil, or I will be violent in protecting things that I love? How will karma or the rule of Ahimsa judge me now? If, for example, I am afraid also of committing the sin of omission, for example, na to be a bystander when something is being killed in front of me, for example, I cannot but be violent towards the oppressor. So how should karma judge my violence against an oppressor or an evil?
Yes. So, in the perspective of violence for laymen, so I discussed 4 types of violence. First is occupational, second is domestic, third is protective, and the fourth is intentional. So when we talk about violence for a layman, then first 3, occupational, then a domestic and protective violence is allowed. But intentional violence is not allowed. Again, and there is a definition by Acharya Amrit Chandra. He said that any action, if we perform any action with the effect of deceit, greed, so anger, then we are going to commit violence. But if we perform any activity, any household action, but we are out of these four passions, that is called kasai, sticky in Jain terminology, so then you are not going to do any violence at the level of layman, right? And for ascetic, actually, these all four types of violence are required to refrain. But for layman, these three types of violence are permitted. So did you get your answer?
Yes po. Thank you very much, both Dr. Doranek and Dr. Pandey.
All right, thank you also, Kenneth. So we proceed to the next question. This comes from Gia from the IKT community. Okay, so I assume it's for both the resource speakers. So the question is, does Jainism take an absolutist stance on nonviolence in situations where resistance becomes necessary? For example, the national struggle of subjugated countries against colonialist aggressors. So perhaps Dr. Kojan, you may have your opinion for his question first. You are muted, Dr. Kojan.
Sorry. So I think we need to distinguish between two different uses of the term absolute, right? Absolute nonviolence can also be called principled nonviolence. That can be the idea that nonviolence is not just a strategy, but it's actually the higher good that you're aspiring towards. Versus strategic nonviolence, which is that nonviolence might be a good strategy sometimes, or we might use violence when it works better in other times. So I would say that in general, Jain tradition is principled nonviolence rather than strategic nonviolence. And that is to say, but that's one way of talking about absolute. The other way of the term absolute gets understood is it means binary, right? Absolute means that either violence or nonviolence. And if you choose nonviolence, then you must engage in absolutely no violence at all. And Jain tradition, we didn't go much into Jain logic, but we have anekantavad, syadvad, nyavad. These are forms of what we call dialectic logic. And this is the resistance to the idea of an illicit disjunction of binary logic. Sorry, that was a lot of big words. It's the idea that it's not either this or that most of the time in life. Generally, logic involves more of a both and. And this is why we say it's not that either you're engaged in violence or you're engaged in nonviolence, but rather it is that you're making the choice of least violence. There's an acknowledgement that all actions are some mixture of violence and nonviolence. So in that sense, it's like not really absolute in the sense it's not invoking a binary, either violence or non-violence, but it is an absolute in the sense that it is the highest guiding principle that it always must be deferred to. Now, to address the idea of social change, social strategy, I think in general, Jains very much applaud the example set by nonviolence of Gandhi, Mahatma Gandhi. And in that nonviolent theory, there's a lot that can be said for that. But that's argued for not just as a principled way, but it's also more effective, right? So for example, in the 20th century, there have been multiple places where the main principle of Gandhian nonviolence is that the result will be similar to the means. If you try to get independence through violence, then the result will be violence. For example, if you try to, in the Russian Revolution of 1917, you use violence to overthrow the violence of the white Russian aristocracy, then what do you get? If the path you use is violence, then the result will be violence, and you get this horribly violent regime. And we see this over and over and over again, where violence is very effective in overthrowing governments. But generally what it does is it just produces more violent governments. And there's a lot more that can be said on that, but I'll give Dr. Pandey a chance. Sorry, if I'm too long.
Yes. So I missed the question. So just a minute. Judge Denialism taken absolute stance on non-violence in situations where resistance became necessary. Yes, I discussed about protective violence. So in that case, protective violence for the security of a nation, even for a security of an individual person, for protection, protective violence is permitted. So in that case, you see, the first Tirthankar, Rishabdev, he taught us three main things that is called Asi, Masi, Krisi. Asi means skill of writing. Kasi means skill of agriculture. And Masi, skill of instrument that is called weapon. So if you need to protect your nation, even if you need to protect yourself, then that case for layman, you are permitted to take action, whether it may be violent. Did you get my point?
Sorry, Dr. Pandey, I got disconnected a little while ago. Perhaps we may ask Gia from the IKT community if he agrees or if he is already satisfied with your answers. But okay, so he's already satisfied. So thank you. Okay, so for our next questions, you may either put it in the chat box or you may raise hand, use the raise hand feature of our Zoom meetings platform. Okay. Okay, so siguro I'll have a question also. This one is directed to Dr. Pandey. This is with regard to your presentation earlier, wherein also with your answers, with your recent answers, wherein you are distinguishing between the ascetic, uh, ascetic,
Ascetic way of life.
uh, ascetic way of life versus the layman way of living, the Jain way of life.
Yes.
The question is, can we infer that the degree of
Wala,
achieving the
dili na kumatla
sorry, okay, the question is that is the degree of achieving the goal of living the Jain way of life, which is from what I have understood is to to discover the pure happiness within us, as per Dr. Kochen. Does it differ? Does the degree differ with living the ascetic way of life? Is the degree greater with living the ascetic way of life than the living the layman's living way of the Jain tenet?
Yes, you are right. Actually, as I discussed, the ultimate goal of human life, according to Jain tradition, or you can say according to all Indian traditions, to achieve liberation. So, everlasting happiness. Liberation means everlasting happiness. So, when we discussed way of life, as I told that Ahimsa is the supreme value. So, there are 12 vows in Jain tradition to achieve the state of everlasting happiness. Because through our actions, through our duties, the happiness which we gain is not permanent, is not everlasting, it's temporary. That is called worldly happiness. So worldly happiness is not permanent. So for everlasting happiness, we need to follow all 12 vows. Right? So, and completely, not partially. but it is not possible for a layman. So the 12 vows for laymen, what they do, they prepare a man to attain the state of ascetic life. Three things are there. See, three types of karmas there. As Dr. Kozen discussed, auspicious and inauspicious. Right? So our effort is to move from inauspicious to auspicious. You can say it bad to good. But these both types of karma cause bondage. If you are performing some activities with some good emotions, with good desires, then in that case also, karma particles stick with our soul and they create bondage. So our aim is to move from bad to good and then to pure. So in Jain tradition, good and bad, these both conditions are come under the category of, you can say, bondage, impure. But our ultimate goal is to move to pure state. So in layman life, our total effort is to move from bad to good. And three categories are there in the vows. The first is, which I discussed in my talk, Aduvrat, minor vows. Right? Then Gudavrat, that is called enhancing vows. And the third is training vows, that is called Shiksha. So Gudavrat enhance our capability to move towards the practices of ascetic practices. And when we followed all types of good vratas, then we move to Siksha Vrata, that is called enhancing vows, training vows. And in the last stage of training vows, we enter into the ascetic life and we renounce everything. And without accepting the way of, without observing the way of ascetic life, the ultimate goal of human life, that is moksha, liberation, permanent bliss, everlasting happiness, whatever you like to say, is not possible. So desirelessness here in human life, for layman, we have desires. Even Jain tradition says, if you have to desire of liberation, then there is no possibility to liberate. So at a moment, you need to renounce the desire of moksha also. And it is possible through meditation, that is called yoga in Jain tradition, path of liberation, Samyak Darshan, Samyak Gyan, Samyak Charit. There are three ways. And if you follow completely the right conduct, that is called Samyak Charit, there is a stage where that is called Sukla Dhyan, supreme meditation. In that state, even you forgot what is the goal of your meditation. And you observe yourself in the pure state. So desirelessness is not possible for a layman. It is possible only for an ascetic. So yes, the grade, the level of purity is more better in ascetic life than layman life. There is no desire.
Well, Dr. Pandey, it sounds very challenging. From what I understood, the life of being an ascetic Jain is very challenging because you are aiming to be an ascetic, yet you have to uh, eliminate your desire to live the ascetic way of living. So it's kind of an ironic statement.
Actually, it's a gradual process. And you know, Jain believes in many life after death also. So our karma, which we perform in this life, our actions, this decides our next life. So it's not, yes, so it's not a momentary process. It's a gradual process, one by one. So yes.
Okay, I understand, Doctor. Okay, so we move with the next question. This comes from Victor Victoria. So he put in the chat box. Good morning, dear speakers. I am Victor Victoria, an AB literature student from San Beda University. I would like to ask either of the speakers a question. The particular example of the closed mask being used so that microorganisms will not be inhaled really intrigues me. I believe it is a good defensive measure, especially when considering microorganisms as life forms. But in cases where this measure fails, our souls are not in control of the bodily functions in charge of attacking invasive microorganisms. It is something our body does whether we like it or not. So my question is, does the attacking of invasive microorganisms, which we are not in control of, affect our karmic balance? So, Dr. Kojan, you may go first.
What a fascinating question. I mean, it's pretty nuanced. I mean, again, if we go back to Dr. Pandey's emphasis on intentionality, we could say, well, maybe it does, but obviously it's not going to be very much karma. But we could also look at it from the other perspective. Is it's true, just the very act of living has got violence inevitably tied to it in so many different ways. So I would say the immune response of your body is maybe like the smallest form of violence that you do. But nonetheless, we'll find that with mendicants and ascetics, ultimately they refuse medical treatment, and they'll refuse dental treatment as well too, so that they don't add to that sort of harm as well too. But I would say that, and then back to the sort of gradation between what it's like to be a lay Jain versus a mendicant, you know, it's a point that Dr. Pandey keeps coming back to. You have to really consider where you are honestly, satya, right? You have to be honest with yourself. You know, don't try to be a austere mendicant if that's not your duty in life, if that's not your level of attainment. So for example, if you could like refuse medical and dental treatment in a way that you maintain a sense of mental equanimity, right, where you're not desiring. But I think most of us, if we were to refuse medical and dental treatment, it would have the effect of intensifying our desire. And I think that that wouldn't be a good result. So if we don't have that level of mental equanimity and we try to renounce beyond what our actual current capacities are because we're not being honest with ourselves, we're being arrogant, then I think it's going to have a backlash and we're going to actually end up doing violence to ourselves. And then the other way of looking at this is if you're renouncing things like medical treatment or dental treatment, you also have to consider your duties to others. Now, one of the things that makes an ascetic or an ascetic is that they've sort of renounced their duties to families and to society and a job and those sort of things. So if they are to renounce medical treatment and to die as a result, they won't be creating violence towards those people who depend on them, right? But if you're a lay Jain and you have a job, you're an employer, you're a coworker, you have family, you have dependents, you have parents, you have kids, everybody depends on you, and you take a course of action which, you know, like refuse a medical treatment and then you die, you're arguably creating more violence by letting down your various different duties and social duties. So it would be a little inappropriate for a lay person to take that level of renunciation of turning down medical treatment because they haven't gone through the proper levels of renunciation of social duties. So again, it's a matter of gradation. Again, that was another point that Dr. Pandey made, is that we have to be very honest with ourselves before we try to renounce beyond what our current capabilities are psychologically, but our current capabilities are in terms of our social duties as well too. So, I mean, it's an interesting thought. So I would say, yes, the very fact that you're alive, you're engaging in violence, even very subtle, maybe in your immune system, it's probably the least amount of violence you're doing. You're getting way more violence from eating and from, purchasing things and, things like that. And there's not really much we can do about that other than refuse a medical procedures. And I think that you'd have to be very cautious with that to make sure that you're not doing that out of arrogance and that you're really, you've attained the necessary level. Anyway, that would be my short answer. I don't know how Dr. Pandey wants to address that one. It's an interesting question.
Yes, actually intention is very important. What is your intention? Is your intention to kill microbes, or your intention is to make yourself fit? Because there is a very famous saying, sound mind in a sound body. And in Jain tradition, the body is considered as a means to achieve our goal. So it is very necessary to make our body suitable for performing, it may be worldly duties or transworldly responsibilities for a spiritual path. But the healthy body is the first preference to perform either auspicious or inauspicious, any type of conduct. So intention is very important. If your intention is to make your body fit, make your body suitable to perform necessary duties, then for a layman, you are permitted. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Pandey and Dr. Kojan, for your answers. Okay, so we have another question from Christian Sorbito from the Society of African Missions of St. Paul Seminary. So he wrote in the chat, do our daily rituals meditate? If yes, why are we not informed about them? And why there is no emphasis on physical exercise? However, the Jain Dharma does not believe God is the creator. Therefore, Jainism is a selfish religion. It emphasizes only personal spiritual progress but does not emphasize helping the poor and needy. My question is about the Jain community all over the country. And since Jains have always been known to be absolutely honest, there is true religiosity. Their honesty, truthfulness, and charitable nature always made them helpful to the common people, though never the missionaries of their religion. I am Christian Zurbito from SMA, Society of African Missions, Seminary and first year, AB Philosophy in St. Paul Seminary. So it seems very a challenging question to both of the speakers. Who goes first? Dr. Kojan again?
Well, I would say, first of all, it's impolite in interfaith dialogue to accuse your dialogical partner of being selfish. So that doesn't really reflect well on one's own position. And if one is trying to represent their own tradition, that's not a very good start. It's not being a good ambassador of your own tradition. So interfaith dialogue is usually best done with the spirit of peace building, right? And with peace building, we want to show each other mutual goodwill, and we want to assume the best of each other rather than assuming the worst of each other. So that's the first point that I would make. The second point that I would make is that it's not true that Jainism does not emphasize helping the poor and the needy. Actually, if you listen to my lecture, I'm not sure if you heard that, but the emphasis on non-consumption is a way of helping the poor and the needy, because of the relationship between consumption, global capitalism, the distribution of wealth. Dr. Pandey pointed this out with the relationship between the parigraha and the inequitable distribution of wealth as well. So very much actually the idea is that we solve the world's problems by engaging in our ethical behavior. And the more ethical we are, the less we're contributing to systems of violence, systematic violence. So I think I made that very clear, how non-consumption and non-violence is a way of sort of boycotting industries of violence, and therefore helping the poor and the needy is very much a central part of it. That being said, Jains are known for social work as well too. Jains run animal shelters. Jains do all kinds of socially progressive work that involves helping the needy. So the characteristic of Jainism is selfishness is a little peculiar, and it makes me wonder if this person was really attentive to the spirit of the lecture here, because it's very much about getting rid of selfish desire, and that was kind of the whole spirit of the talk there. So I'll leave it at that. I don't know if Dr. Pandey wants to add anything.
Yes. So roughly, when we go through the Jain tradition, not only Jain tradition, all Indian tradition seems like individualistic. Actually, my presentation was focused on non-violence, so I didn't go in detail. As I discussed, there are 12 vows. In my presentation, I discussed only 5, and I was focused on non-violence. So I made a statement during my lecture that there are 6 essentials that are needed to followed by each and every Jain. If you are not following them, then you are not a Jain by practice. Number 1. To prepare a layman to become a Jain. So under these 6 essential duties, charity is very important. Charity. So for layman, aparigraha means, although literal meaning is non-possession, but for a layman, aparigraha means earn as much you can earn, but share. This is the meaning of charity according to Jain tradition. Earn and share. Number 1. So it comes under the 6 essential duties. When you are trying to become a householder, a Jain householder, and under the enhancing vows, that is called Gud Vrata in Jain tradition, again this term Vaiyavritti comes. So donation, charity is very important part of Jain way of life. And you can see in practice also, in India, the population of Jains are very less than 1%, less than 0.5%. But their contribution in charity is very larger, more than 35%. Their population is less than 0.5%. And in the terms of charity, their contribution is more than 35%. So you will find the vow of charity in their practices also. So though the ultimate goal is to achieve liberation, but for you can say, renouncing, the practice of renouncing, this is the necessary part. The charity is the necessary part. It is a part of renouncement. You earn and then you donate, you give charity. So it is very necessary part of 12 vows even. And for becoming a Jain, if you not donate in society, so it is not possible to become a Jain. The you can say fundamental formula parasparo pagraho jivana, live and let live, is the fundamental of Jain philosophy, Ahimsa, and the theory of let and let live is the basic of Jain Ahimsa. So although from spiritual point of view, the philosophy is a very individualistic, but to achieve the state so that you may able to achieve liberation, this is the fundamental virtue. Charity is the fundamental virtue. I think you got your answer.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Dr. Kojan and Dr. Pandey. In behalf of that question, I am sorry for that. Again, I remind our audience that we are having here an intercultural dialogue that is not meant to, in a way, degrade the other cultures. We are promoting here positive peace among the intercultural dialogues. Dr. James Piscos, before the last
Yeah.
question from Dr. Isabel,
Let
from
me
Isabella.
comment on that question because when we go into philosophy, we should have first and foremost an attitude of listening because we listen to the multiplicity of ideas, and in listening to the multiplicity of ideas, we learn to respect the different viewpoints, and from these different viewpoints, then from that respect, judging the other to be correct or not, it is a listening attitude. And in that listening attitude, that's why we're here, because we learn from each other. And you see, the idea of non-violence was taught by attitude of listening even to enemies and listening to everybody. So I think that should be the beginning of wisdom is listening. And from there, we can see Ahimsa or what you call that, the non-violence, and of course follow the recognition of the multiplicity of ideas, a non-possession. All these are important ingredients of our pursuit to happiness. We might be in the different stages of happiness, but we respect that level. And let me say to our speakers, these are young people, so please forgive us if it appeared to be a little bit off tangent, but that's why I raised my hand, because I want to clear to everybody that our conference is aimed to develop that attitude of interfaith dialogue, to be gentle in our words, to be kind to each other, to listen to each other's journey. So that's it. John is almost, so probably we can proceed to the next part.
Okay, Doc. Okay, so sorry, I know meron pang remaining questions that we cannot anymore entertain. Perhaps we can, yeah, you can refer those questions to Dr. James in your respective classes during your classes. You can talk about that. Okay, so to thank both our resource speakers, Dr. Shrinetra Pandey and Dr. Kojan Bohanek, for their time and wisdom. On behalf of St. Paul Seminary, we present the Certificate of Appreciation to, just wait a moment, mag-share screen lang. Okay, we present the Certificate of Appreciation given to Dr. Shrinetra Pandey and Dr. Kojan Bohanek, for their insightful and remarkable presentation on the topic Nonviolence, Ahimsa in the Light of Jainism during the St. Paul Seminary Foundation International Philosophy Symposium, given this March 8, 2023 via the Zoom sessions. To be signed by Dr. James Loreto C. Piscos, PhD, and Father Norman R. Peña, Jr., SSP, PhD, both from St. Paul Seminary Foundation. So let us give them a virtual round of applause.
Thank you very much.
Right.
It's very, very gracious. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you also. Okay, so for our closing remarks, we once again welcome Dr. James Loreto Piscos. Perhaps he might have some post-event announcements and some comments, and we also appreciate the time and effort of Dr. James Loreto Piscos. Without him, this event would not be made possible. So, Dr. James, your final words.
Hello, can you unshare? I want to see myself, okay. So first, I thank our two, Dr. Kun, is that pronounced well? Because I was given a proper pronunciation of his name, and then Dr. Pandey. There are just professors and for the topic. I'm so privileged so we're able to hear the insights, we're able to hear a different perspective, we're able to see different ideas, and that's the philosophy all about. And thank you for offering us. I know that some of us are interested, some of my friends, and allow me to take this opportunity in the Philippines. I will be glad to recommend them to your university or to your. That's why I'm here also as part of a liaison officer, bringing some students from Santa, from of course St. Paul's study, to studies related to non-violence or other related things. This is not the end. In fact, this is the beginning. We will have a series of discussions, discourses, fora, different roundtable discussions, and hopefully can generate more young people to have an attitude of welcoming each other, to have an attitude of embracing each other's differences and uniqueness. So we'll be able to create that harmonious world where there is no more conflict and war, but the people who are able to be and eventually everlasting. So with my sincere gratitude, and my heart is full of gratitude right now when I was seeing and listening both speakers who are having their different schedule, but here to join us. Thank you very much. Of course, Father Norman, thank you also. To thank the 7 students enrolled in the subject, Modern Asian Thoughts, led by John and Sister and all of them, 7 of them, are actually work hard in order to make this possible. And for everybody, there is no conflict.
I think Dr. Pitos disconnected. Perhaps his signal is weak. Okay, so I guess we can just end it here. But before we end, let us take a photo opportunity. I suggest everyone to open your cameras and remove the spotlight. Wait lang. Okay. I suggest everyone to turn on your cameras so that we can have the photo opportunity. Okay, so we'll have how many batches? We'll have 8 screenshots. So just smile throughout the duration of the process of screenshotting of my fellow moderators. Okay. So, sino ikaw na? Sige, screen record. Okay, so I'll count 1, 2, 3, 8 times. Okay, so 1, 2, 3. Okay, so batch number 2. 1, 2, 3. Okay, smile. Next, 1, 2, 3, smile. Batch number 4. 1, 2, 3, smile. Okay. Okay. Batch number 5. 1, 2, 3, smile. Nasa 5, hindi na naka-off yung camera. 6, 1, 2, 3, smile. Kahit naka-off yung cam. Smile lang kayo. Batch 7, 1, 2, 3, smile. And then lastly, batch number 8, 1, 2, 3, smile. All right, so that ends our event for today. I hope everyone had very insightful key takeaways from our respected resource speakers. Again, we send our deepest appreciation to Dr. Shrinetra Pandey and Dr. Kojan Bohanek, as well as to Dr. James Loreto Piscos for making this event possible, and to our Dean of Studies, Father Norman Melchor R. Peña Jr. All right, so I wish you that you have a masarap na tanghalian. All right, bye-bye. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.